The letter arrived on the morning of the summer solstice, which Margaret Fenn would later understand was the universe's idea of a joke. She was standing at the kitchen table of her aunt's house in Devizes, one hand pressed flat against the wood to keep herself steady, reading the same sentence for the fourth time. The Duke of Ashvale regrets that his household has been called to Keswick without delay, and trusts that Miss Fenn will find the journey north no inconvenience. She had sold the better of her 2 dresses to pay the coach fare to London. She had arrived at the appointed townhouse in Grosvenor Street on the appointed morning to find the knocker off the door, and a caretaker who looked at her the way one looks at tradespeople who have come to the wrong entrance. She was not yet 27. She had not yet broken anything she could not mend. She did not know that by the time midsummer turned the light golden over the northern fells, she would have broken something she had not known was whole. She had 3 weeks before the papers were to be signed. Her uncle's solicitor had made this plain, the agreement of settlement between the Fenn estate, such as it remained, and the Duchy of Ashvale was contingent on Miss Fenn's presentation to the ducal family and their formal approval. If approval was not given before the 1st of July, the debt her father had left behind him, the beautiful catastrophic debt that had devoured everything including the better dress, would pass without remedy. 3 weeks to travel 300 miles and charm a family she had never met into agreeing she was a suitable match for a man she had met precisely twice and liked well enough, which was more than she'd expected. 3 weeks. She folded the solicitor's letter into quarters and tucked it inside her cuff, where she kept the things she needed to remember. The journey north took 4 days and offered ample opportunity for contemplation. Margaret was good at contemplation. She had been practicing it since she was 12 years old, and her father had first shown her the ledgers with the air of a man confessing to a priest, and she had looked at the numbers and understood that the life she had expected to have was already gone. She had become, in the years since, exceptionally useful. She could manage an estate of moderate size, read a contract for embedded mischief, identify the moment a negotiation had tilted, and tell from the angle of a man's shoulders whether he was about to lie. These were not qualities that made her sought after at assemblies. They were qualities that had kept her aunt's household solvent through 2 bad harvests and a dishonest steward. She had long since accepted, the kind of woman who was prized in crisis and overlooked in comfort, and she had made of this a sort of armor, light to carry, effective enough. She arrived in Keswick on a Tuesday evening when the light was still long and gold, the fells rising on all sides like sleeping animals. The Ashvale carriage that met her at the coaching inn was very fine and very silent. The footman who handed her up did not meet her eyes. She noted this and filed it. The way she filed everything. Ashvale Hall declared itself before she was ready for it. The drive was 2 miles of beech trees, and then the trees gave way to stone, gray and enormous and entirely serious, a building that had been standing long enough to have opinions about the people who moved through it. Margaret straightened her back and looked at it squarely, because looking at things squarely was the only policy she had ever found to work. The housekeeper met her at the door, a woman of 60 or so, with the posture of someone who had spent decades holding up rooms by sheer rectitude. Her name, she said, was Mrs. Hartley, and she would show Miss Fenn to her rooms, and dinner was at 8, and she hoped Miss Fenn was not fatigued. Not especially, Margaret said, though I'd welcome the chance to wash the coach dust off before I meet anyone who matters. Mrs. Hartley looked at her for a moment with an expression that gave nothing away, and then something shifted in the region of her mouth that was not quite a smile. I'll have hot water sent up directly. The room they gave her was pleasant and slightly too far from the main corridor to be convenient. She noted this too. She was brushing the dust from her second-best dress, the only dress now, technically, when she heard the voices in the hallway outside. A woman's voice, low and deliberate, with the confident cadence of someone accustomed to being agreed with. It hardly signifies. She will see what we all see, or she will be managed. Either way, the arrangement proceeds. And then a second voice, a man's, quieter and flatter. My lord is not a man who appreciates management. And the first voice again, a little cooler. My lord is not presently consulted. The footsteps retreated. Margaret stood with the brush in her hand and listened to the silence they left behind, and understood that she had arrived in the middle of something she did not yet have all the pieces of. She would find the pieces. She always found the pieces. It was, for better or worse, the thing she was for. She came down to dinner prepared for inspection, which was what the evening clearly intended to be. The Ashvale family assembled in the yellow drawing room were, at first count, Lady Sophia Marne, the Duke's first cousin, and, as she established within the first 4 minutes, the person who had been managing the household since the previous Duchess died 2 years past. She was exquisitely dressed and had the kind of beauty that takes effort to achieve and makes certain the effort does not show. She wore on her right hand a ring with a dark red stone that caught the candlelight every time she moved, which was often. Beside her, Lord Frederick Marne, her husband, younger than she and considerably less vivid, the sort of man who has learned to economize his presence. A young woman of perhaps 18 was introduced as Lady Sophia's niece, visiting from Bath. She had the bewildered look of someone who had arrived at a party and found it to be an examination. And there was an elderly man in a chair near the fire who was introduced as Mr. Cutbirth, the ducal solicitor, and who looked at Margaret with the measuring attention of a man adding columns. The Duke himself was not there. Lady Sophia explained, with a beautiful smile, that her cousin had been detained on the estate. He would join them when he could. She was sorry for the informality. Not at all, Margaret said. I am used to informality. She said this pleasantly and watched Lady Sophia decide she had been insulted and then decide she hadn't. The dark red ring flashed. Dinner was excellent and almost completely without useful information, which told her a great deal. Lady Sophia steered every topic with the practiced ease of someone who has been steering conversations so long she no longer notices she is doing it. The food was praised, the weather was mourned. The Bath niece was asked about her journey and responded in syllables. Mr. Cutbirth ate in professional silence. Lord Frederick Marne twice attempted to say something and thought better of it. The second time, after a glance from his wife so gentle it would have been impossible to call it a warning. Margaret ate the excellent food and asked careful questions and watched Lady Sophia's right hand move every time Margaret spoke, the dark red ring catching light, and waited. She was almost at her door when Lady Sophia found her. The corridor was dim, the household quieted for the night, and Lady Sophia moved through the dimness as though she owned the dark as well as the rooms. She had changed out of dinner clothes and wore a wrapper of dark green silk, and she looked, Margaret thought, more dangerous at rest than at table. I hope you found everything to your comfort, Miss Fenn. The smile was perfect and entirely without warmth. Entirely, thank you. I hope also, Lady Sophia continued, in the same gracious tone, that you are not a woman who is easily startled. There are aspects of the household situation which the solicitors may not have communicated as fully as they might. Margaret waited. My cousin, Lady Sophia said, was not consulted in this arrangement. He has been preoccupied. His estate management has suffered. It was felt by those of us who know him best that an arrangement of mutual benefit could be reached without troubling him with negotiations he would only have found distressing. She paused. I mention this so that you might calibrate your expectations appropriately. That is very thoughtful of you, Margaret said. It is practical. Expectations which are properly calibrated rarely disappoint. And yours? Margaret asked. Properly calibrated, are they? Lady Sophia looked at her for one long moment, and something moved in her expression that was not the smile, something older and less decorative. Quite, she said, and turned and walked back down the corridor, and the candle she carried took its warmth with it. Margaret went into her room and lit her own candle and sat on the edge of the bed and thought. Not consulted. His estate management has suffered. It was felt by those of us who know him best. She laid these phrases out side by side the way she laid out accounts, looking for what the numbers implied about the numbers she hadn't been shown. Then she took out the solicitor's letter from her cuff and read it again. The wording, she noticed now, was careful. The agreement of settlement was contingent on the ducal family's formal approval, not the Duke's, the family's. She folded the letter again. 3 weeks. She met the Duke the next morning, unexpectedly, which she later thought was probably the only way one could meet him. She had woken early and found her way to the kitchen garden before anyone else was about, because kitchen gardens in high summer are one of the places where thinking comes most easily. She was crouched beside a row of beans, examining the soil with the automatic assessment of someone who had kept a kitchen garden through difficult seasons, when she heard boots on the flagged path and stood and turned. He was very tall. She had not known that, having met him twice at a distance and across crowded rooms. He was tall and broad-shouldered and had the working hands that Lady Sophia's gloves worked so hard to conceal the absence of, roughened at the knuckles, stained at the thumb, the hands of a man who came at his land directly rather than through agents. He was perhaps 32 or 33, and his face was the kind that in easier circumstances might have been described as handsome, but which grief, and there was grief in it, unmistakably, the drawn particular set of a man who has been sad for longer than sadness should last, had made instead into something more austere and less approachable. He looked at her with gray eyes that were neither warm nor cold but simply present, as though he were accustomed to arriving at things as they actually were, rather than as he hoped. "You are in my kitchen garden," he said. "Your cook is losing the beans to rust," Margaret said. "There's a spray of copper sulfate that would manage it, but it needs to go on before the pods set, or it will taint them." There was a silence of perhaps 5 full seconds. He looked at her. She looked back. "You must be Miss Fenn," he said. "I am, and I suspect you are not simply a man who walks in kitchen gardens before breakfast." She let the question sit. "Crispin Mayor," he said, "Ashvale, though you appear to have already gathered that. You didn't know I was here. It was not quite a question." Something shifted in his face, a small compression around the eyes that might have been any number of things, and which she read, because she always read these things, as controlled anger managing not to arrive at its destination. "I've been on the east quarter of the estate since Thursday. The drainage problem in the lower fields has been—" He stopped. "No, I did not know you were here. I apologize. It is not the welcome you deserve after the distance you have traveled." "I've had less gracious welcomes," she said, "and have survived them. What I would like, if you are not pressed for time, is to hear from you directly what you understand this arrangement to be." She watched him decide, in the space of 2 seconds, whether she was worth the honesty. She was used to this calculation. She waited for it to complete. "I understand it," he said, "to be a solution to a problem I was not fully shown until the solution was already proposed. And what problem is that?" "The estate accounts." He said it without particular expression, as a man states a fact he has made his peace with. "My mother's illness was long and expensive, and I was not attentive enough to the ledgers in those years. I have spent the past 18 months attempting to repair the damage. I was told that a further loan at reasonable terms had been negotiated as a bridge measure. He paused. I was not told that the loan was contingent on a marriage contract until a month ago. A loan contingent on a marriage contract. She turned this over. And the Fenn side of the arrangement? Your father's debts are to be settled as part of the settlement agreement. Your provision is a portion of the Ashvale income in perpetuity, whether, he stopped again, with the particular carefulness of a man navigating a sentence that has more edges than he'd anticipated when he began it. Whether the arrangement proceeds in its fullest form or not. Whether we actually marry, you mean? Yes, she appreciated this so much she nearly said so. She said instead, and do you know who structured this arrangement on the Ashvale side? Mr. Cutbirth manages the legal instrument. My cousin's household has managed he paused again, and this time she could see him arriving at something, some alignment of facts that had not aligned before. Has managed a great deal, he said, slowly, that I apparently believed I was managing myself. Yes, Margaret said. I think that is probably right. They stood in the kitchen garden in the early light, among the rusting beans, and looked at each other with the attention of two people who have both been given incomplete information and are trying to determine how much of the gap the other person can fill. Miss Fenn, he said. Your Grace. I have made a considerable mess of my own situation through insufficient attention. He said this as a man does who has passed the stage of self-reproach and arrived at the stage of clear accounting. I would like very much to correct it, and I suspect that doing so will require, he looked at the kitchen garden, considerably more than a copper sulfate solution. Most messes do, she said. His mouth moved. It was the smallest motion. Not a smile, not quite. More like the recognition that a smile was something that could theoretically occur. She noted it and filed it alongside everything else. Will you tell me, he said, what you observed last night? She told him. She was precise and brief, and she watched his face the whole time, the way it settled and stilled as she spoke. The way a man's face does when things are clicking into a pattern he had been trying to see in the dark. When she finished, he said, The ring. I beg your pardon? The ring my cousin wears. On her right hand. A dark red stone, set in old gold. He looked at her directly. It belonged to my mother. It is not. He stopped. It is not hers to wear. Margaret said nothing. She let the silence work. I need to understand the full scope of it, he said, before I can do anything useful. There are things I cannot yet lay before you, Miss Fenn. Documents I must examine first. Accounts I must trace. He looked at her with the gray eyes that withheld precisely as much as they offered. Will you trust me for a little time? It was a question shaped like a statement, which she found she liked. I will trust you, she said, for exactly as long as you continue to speak to me as though I have a brain. This time, something did happen to his mouth, brief, reluctant, and entirely genuine. That seems a reasonable term. It is the only term I have. She heard the kitchen maid coming through the back gate, and they separated with the naturalness of two people who have agreed, without discussing it, that this conversation had not yet happened. He went back through the garden gate. She went to find breakfast, and the summer pressed down on the fells like a warm hand, and everything began. The household ran on Lady Sophia's rhythms, and Margaret set herself to learn them the way she had learned her aunt's house, by being quietly, usefully present, and waiting for people to forget she was there. She was good at being forgotten. It was the oldest tool she had, and the one that had served her longest. She spent the mornings in the library, which nobody seemed to use, and which had the great advantage of being adjacent to Mr. Cutbirth's working room through a door that was thin enough, if one happened to be standing near the east shelf selecting a book, to carry voices from the other side. She spent the afternoons walking the kitchen gardens and the estate's home fields with whoever would have her, which varied, the head gardener, who was taciturn but informative, Mrs. Hartley, who was beginning, cautiously, to be something approaching friendly, and once, on a bright Wednesday that she kept afterward like a coin, the Duke himself, who arrived at the south field where she was inspecting the drainage work, and said nothing for 20 minutes except to point out a problem in the stone wall, and then asked her what she thought about the management of the upper pastures, and listened to her answer with the focused attention of a man who genuinely wanted to know. "You sound like someone who has managed land," he said. "My uncle's, for 3 years after his bailiff retired, and before anyone agreed I was too young to be trusted with it." She kept her voice dry. "I was 22. I saved them £400 in a single season by reading the water rights agreement correctly." He looked at the stone wall. "They thanked you by marrying you off. They thanked me by finding a new bailiff and continuing to invite me to dinner." She paused. "I am used to usefulness being the ceiling." There was a short silence in which she was aware of him being very still. He had a quality of stillness that was entirely different from passivity. It was more like a great piece of machinery that had gone quiet and could at any moment turn. "It should not be," he said. No, she let the agreement sit without addition, because some things were better left at their exact weight. On the Thursday, 9 days before the 1st of July, she found the first piece. She had not been searching, precisely. She had simply been useful, as she always was. The Bath niece, whose name was Clara, had dropped a packet of letters in the upper corridor and was weeping about it with the thoroughness that only 18 and being far from home can produce. Margaret had helped her collect them, and had, in the process of collecting, seen the handwriting on the top letter clearly enough to know whose it was. Not Clara's, not Lord Frederick's, not anyone in the household she had been introduced to. She spent that evening in the library listening through the thin door with considerably more attention than she had given it before. What she heard was not much. Mr. Cutbirth's voice, reading something aloud in the flat manner of a man reviewing a document, interest rates, dates, the name of a bank she did not recognize, and Lady Sophia's voice, unhurried. If the accounts are closed before the end of the month, there is nothing he can trace. The transfers from the estate fund appear as maintenance. "I have kept careful records, and then, she is sharper than she looks. And Mr. Cutbirth, she looks at everything." And Lady Sophia, with something that was almost warmth in her voice, and was in fact its opposite, let her look. "There is nothing to see unless you know what you are looking for." And she doesn't know what she is looking for. Margaret stood very still beside the east shelf with her hand on the spine of a book she was not reading, and thought, "But I might, if I had the right place to start." The next morning, she found the Duke in the North Library before breakfast, which appeared to be becoming a habit for both of them that neither had formally acknowledged. "I need to ask you about a bank," she said. "Harman and Vole. Do you know it?" He looked up from the document he was reading with the alertness of a man who has been given an unexpected co-ordinate. "It is a private clearing bank used principally by the wool merchants in the northern counties. I have no account with them." He paused. "I did not know I had any connection with them." "You may not know everything you have a connection with," Margaret said. "I think that may be rather the point." She watched him understand this, not angrily. The anger she had seen in the kitchen garden that first morning had been set aside somewhere, like a tool he'd decided not to reach for until the right moment. He went very still in the way she was beginning to read as decision rather than inaction. "How much time do we have?" he said. 9 days, perhaps less if the accounts are closed before month's end, which I believe is the intention. Then we need the ledgers from the past 3 years. He said this as though settling an account. The estate ledgers, not the copies I have been shown, the originals. Where would the originals be? He looked at the window. If they exist anywhere outside my cousin's control, he said, they would be in my estate manager's rooms in the East Wing. Aldous Rennick. He has been with the estate since before I was born. He paused. I have not asked him because I did not know there was a question. Will you ask him now? This morning. He stood, which made the room reconfigure itself around his height in a way she was beginning to find unremarkable, which she noted as something to attend to. Miss Fenn, when you overheard, how much do you believe Lady Sophia suspects of what you know? Nothing useful. She straightened the stack of letters she'd brought with her. She believes I am sharp and looking. She does not believe I have found anything to look at yet. And have you? Not enough, she said. But I know the shape of the gap. And knowing the shape of a gap is most of the work. He looked at her with the gray eyes that had begun, she thought, to change their quality, not warming exactly, more like a door that was resting slightly more open than it had been. I believe it may be, he said. The Bath niece, Clara, came to find Margaret that afternoon, with the air of someone who has been working up to something for several hours. She was a pleasant young woman, with more observation and less confidence than she knew what to do with, and she sat on the edge of the chair in Margaret's room and folded her hands and said, I think I have done something wrong, and I don't know how wrong. Margaret put down her pen. Tell me. The story came out in pieces, as stories do from 18-year-olds who are frightened. The letters Clara had dropped were letters she had been carrying for Lady Sophia, carrying and posting, and in 2 cases delivering by hand to a solicitor's office in Keswick. She had not read them. She had been told they were household correspondence. She had been told it was a favor. She had been told, and here Clara's voice went very quiet, that Miss Fenn was a schemer who had manufactured the connection to the Duke in order to claim a fortune she had no right to, and that helping Lady Sophia was helping the Duke's family protect him. Margaret listened to all of this without interrupting. When Clara finished, she said, Do you believe that? About me. Clara looked at her with the directness that very young women sometimes have before the world teaches them to hedge it. No, she said. I don't think I ever did. Good. Margaret picked up her pen again, considered, set it back down. The letters you carried. Were they all to the solicitor in Keswick? Mostly. 2 went further. To London, I think. 1 to an address I didn't recognize. Can you describe the address? Clara could. Margaret wrote it down. Then she said, You have not done anything wrong that cannot be undone. What I need from you now is to continue exactly as you have been. Post what you are given. Say nothing that is alarming. And if you are given anything to carry after tomorrow, bring it to me first. Clara nodded, and there was in her face the look of someone who has been carrying a weight they were told was small, and has now been told it is actually significant and feels, paradoxically, relieved. What is happening? She said. Something that has been happening for some time, Margaret said. We are going to stop it. After Clara left, Margaret sat alone and let herself be. For exactly 3 minutes, frightened, she was good at fear, not at suppressing it, but at using it, at letting it run through the calculation and come out the other side as information. She was afraid of what would happen if she was wrong. She was afraid of what would happen if she was right, and they ran out of time. She was afraid, most acutely, that the Duke would prove to be the kind of man who felt that being helped was a form of being managed, and would accept neither. She thought about the kitchen garden, about a man who answered her questions as though they were worth answering. She was not, she decided, afraid of that. 3 days before the 1st of July, Aldous Rennick came to find her. He was a very old man with the careful movements of someone managing a body that had served him longer than bodies are designed to serve, and he looked at her with eyes that were still sharp inside the wrinkled face. He carried a flat leather case of the kind solicitors use, worn at the corners, and he sat down in the chair she offered him and set the case on his knees and folded his hands over it and looked at her. "His Grace tells me," he said, "that you are the person I should show these to." Did he say why? He said you would know what to look for. The old man's mouth arranged itself into something dry and very slightly amused. He said you knew the shape of the gap. She held very still. She had said that in the library 3 days ago and had not said it anywhere else. He had listened that carefully. She kept all of this from her face and said, "May I see them?" Rennick opened the case and handed her a bound set of ledgers, 5 years' worth, and a separate sheaf of loose papers that he had arranged in order by date. She took them and began to read, and Rennick sat quietly in the chair with the patience of a man who has learned over a long career that certain kinds of reading should not be interrupted. It took her 2 hours. The coffee went cold. The afternoon light moved across the floor, and she tracked it without looking up. She read the way she had always read accounts, not line by line but architecturally, looking for the places where the numbers' behavior changed, where small amounts disappeared into categories that accumulated, where maintenance costs bloomed in seasons when no maintenance had been done, where payments to Harman and Vole Bank appeared as estate services rendered and then appeared again as different line items in a different column under different names. When she had finished, she sat for a moment with her hands flat on the ledgers, looking at the window. "How long?" she said. 4 years. Rennick's voice was quiet. She managed the household accounts herself after the previous estate manager retired. His Grace was grieving. He trusted her. There was something in the old man's voice that was not exactly sorrow and not exactly anger, but had qualities of both, the sound of a long loyalty that had watched something be corrupted from a distance and had not known how to name it. "I kept these because I knew something was wrong. I did not know how wrong. I did not know who to bring them to." He looked at her. "I know now," she said. "There is money outside the estate accounts, the transfers to Harman and Vole. Do you know what it amounts to? Over the 4 years, close to £18,000. She had suspected it would be a large number. She had not been prepared for that particular large number. She breathed through it. "The loan," she said. "The loan I was told was negotiated as a bridge measure for the estate accounts. Is it real?" Rennick looked at her steadily. "There is no loan, Miss Fenn. The estate accounts show a surplus. It is smaller than it should be, but it is a surplus. The settlement agreement was not negotiated to save the estate." He paused. "I believe it was negotiated to end an inquiry before one could begin." She looked at the ledger in front of her. The numbers sat there, very calm, as numbers always are, regardless of what they have been made to record. She thought about 300 miles in a coach. She thought about a ring with a dark red stone that caught the candlelight. "Mr. Rennick," she said, "I need 2 things from you. First, these ledgers, with your written attestation that they are the original records and have not been altered since they were in your keeping. Second, your presence at a meeting I need you to attend, date to be confirmed, in front of witnesses." She looked at him directly. I need you to be willing to say, in front of those witnesses, exactly what you have told me." He looked at her for a long moment with the sharp eyes in the old face. Then he said, "I have been waiting 4 years for someone to ask me that." She found the Duke in the East Field at dusk, and they walked the edge of the drainage work while she told him everything. And the sky went slowly from gold to rose to the deep blue that precedes dark, and she watched his face in the changing light and watched him listen with the whole of himself. The way he listened to everything, as though information were a resource too valuable to receive carelessly. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. The fells went dark on all sides, one by one, like candles being covered. £18,000, he said finally. Across 4 years, there may be more in the London accounts. And the settlement agreement. His voice was very even. There was never any debt on your family's side that required it. There was a debt. I sold a dress to pay the coach fare, so I am not going to pretend there wasn't. She kept her voice equally even. But the terms of the settlement, the structure of the agreement, the timeline, the presentation requirement, those were constructed to ensure that I arrived here, that your household was put in the position of approving or rejecting me, and that the pressure of the deadline would be used to close the accounts before anyone could examine them. She paused. I was brought here as a reason to hurry, an external variable that could be used to justify why the solicitor needed everything signed before the month was out. Another silence. Somewhere on the fell, a bird she could not identify was finishing its last business of the day. "Miss Fenn," he said. "Your Grace. I owe you an apology of a scope I am not sure a single conversation can contain." He said this looking at the dark fells rather than at her, which she understood as consideration rather than avoidance, the awareness that looking at her while saying it might make it more difficult for her to hear it plainly. You were used. Badly and deliberately. And you are owed more than an apology. You are owed. He stopped. What I am owed, she said carefully, is the satisfaction of seeing the accounts balanced. That will be sufficient for now. He turned to look at her then. In the last light she could see the gray of his eyes and something in them that was new, not warmer exactly, more like a man who has been in the dark a long time and has recognized, in the direction of a particular window, where the light is actually coming from. I need to tell you something, he said. There is a thing I cannot yet lay before you completely. There are papers I must verify, a document I believe exists among my mother's effects that I have not yet retrieved. If it is there, it changes. He paused. It changes what can be proven. And how? Tell me when you have seen it. I will. He looked at her with the directness she had come to understand was his natural mode, the thing that his grief and his habitual solitude had wrapped in reserve, that was beginning, by slow degrees, to unwrap. Whatever it changes, Miss Fenn, I want you to know that you are not now in the position you were brought here to be in. Whatever the outcome of the next 2 days, the terms of your settlement are. Don't, she said. He stopped. Don't tell me what you intend to do for me, she said. Tell me what we are going to do together. There's a difference, and it matters. In the full dark, walking back toward the lights of the hall, she heard him draw a breath that had a different quality than the ones before it, not quite a laugh, but the closest thing to one she had heard from him yet. 2 days before the 1st of July, Lady Sophia came to offer Margaret a bribe. She came in the afternoon, when the household was quiet, and she sat in the chair in Margaret's room with the composure of a woman who has never in her adult life been uncertain of a room, and she offered, in a voice of beautiful reasonableness, £10,000 and a house in Bristol, and a letter of introduction to a family in Bath who needed a governess for their daughters. All of this in exchange for Margaret signing a statement that she had found the arrangement unsuitable and withdrawn of her own accord. Margaret looked at the ring on Lady Sophia's right hand. "No," she said. Lady Sophia's expression did not change. "The second offer," she said, "which I would prefer not to make, involves a letter I hold, written by your solicitor, which contains certain representations about your father's conduct that were," she paused, selecting, "embellished, for the purpose of securing the arrangement on your side. If this letter were shown to His Grace, it would naturally raise questions about the letter," Margaret said, "is a forgery." Lady Sophia was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice had shed its gracious surface layer, and what was underneath was still beautiful, but different in quality, stripped down to something older and harder. "How very certain you sound." "I am quite certain," Margaret said. "I know my solicitor's hand. I have spent a considerable amount of time reading documents produced in this household over the past fortnight, and I have become familiar with certain patterns in how letters are constructed when the writer does not entirely trust the recipient." She looked at Lady Sophia with the directness she had spent years learning not to use. "You write a beautiful hand, Lady Sophia. But you write very long sentences. My solicitor, Miss Drummond of Devizes, writes very short ones. He was a man who billed by the quarter hour and resented every word. The silence that followed was the loudest thing she had heard in a long time. "What is it you think you are doing?" Lady Sophia said. "What I am doing," Margaret said, "is giving you this opportunity, which I will not give again. Go to Mr. Cutbirth tonight and withdraw the settlement papers. Relinquish what you hold in the estate accounts. And go." She kept her voice entirely without rancor, because rancor would have been beside the point. The alternative is a proceeding that will be considerably less comfortable for everyone in it, including people who deserve better than to be collateral. Lady Sophia stood. The dark red ring caught the last of the afternoon light. "You," she said, "are a dangerous woman to have underestimated." "Yes," Margaret agreed. "I find that I am." Lady Sophia went to the door. There she paused, with her hand on the frame, and turned. And Margaret saw, in her profile in the doorway light, something she had not seen there before. Not the beauty, not the composure, not the beautiful, composed threat, but underneath it, beneath the armor that was the face she had built over years, a woman who had stood second to something for so long that she had stopped being able to remember what she had originally wanted instead. It was very brief, and then it was gone, and Lady Sophia walked away down the corridor, and Margaret sat with it for a moment before she picked up her pen. She did not expect the offer to be taken. But she had made it, plainly and without performance, because it was the right thing to offer. She went to the Duke's study that evening and told him about the offer and the ring. And she watched him listen, and she watched the moment when he arrived at something he had evidently suspected for some time and not wanted to know. "The ring," he said, "was left in trust to be held by the estate in my mother's memory." It was not. He stopped. He rubbed his hand across his face with the tiredness of a man who has been holding something back for weeks. She was to care for the household. That was the arrangement. I gave her authority because I trusted her, and I was grieving, and I believed that the arrangement served everyone. He was quiet for a moment. I believed it because I was told it. I did not look at what I was told. "You looked at the estate," Margaret said. "You were looking at the wrong thing." "Yes, the document," she said. "Your mother's papers. Have you found it?" He reached into his desk and produced a thin folded paper, old, the ink faded at the edges. He handed it to her without a word. She opened it and read it. It was a letter, in a woman's hand, to the family solicitor of the time, not Cutbirth, an earlier man, and it concerned the disposition of the ducal household in the event of the duke's incapacity or absence. The instructions were specific. The authority was specific. And the ring was listed by description as a trust object, not to be transferred or worn outside the family until a specific future date, a date which was, Margaret noted, still 3 years away. Lady Sophia had been wearing property she had no legal right to wear for 2 years. "This needs to be seen tomorrow," Margaret said. "I have summoned witnesses," he said. "Cutbirth, because he must be there. Rennick, because he should be. Lord Frederick, because he deserves the chance to know what his wife has done before he is made to hear it publicly. And 2 men from the county, a magistrate who is my neighbor, and an honest one, and the manager of the Ashvale Bank." He looked at her. "Is there anyone else?" She thought about Clara. "The niece," she said. "She carried letters she didn't know the content of. She should be there, not to testify. She cannot testify to things she didn't read. But she should know what happened." She paused. "She kept your letters safe. She came to me when she understood something was wrong. She is owed the truth." He nodded. Then he said, "And you. What you say in that room tomorrow will decide it. More than the ledgers. More than the letter. The ledgers will decide it," she corrected, "and the letter. And Mr. Rennick, who has been waiting 4 years to say what he knows in front of the right people. I am the one who knows what question to ask and where to stand." She held the letter out to him. "Keep this safe tonight." He took it, and their fingers touched briefly around the paper, and neither of them spoke for a moment. "I wish," he said finally, "that you had arrived here under different circumstances. Which circumstances would you prefer?" "Ones in which I had been consulted," he said. "Ones in which I might have." He stopped. She could see him weighing the sentence, deciding how much of it he was willing to speak aloud. "Ones in which the first time I met you in the kitchen garden was not because you had been sent here as a deadline and a distraction." She looked at him with the careful attention she had applied to everything in this house from the first morning, and she read, in the stillness of him, in the quality of the restraint, the shape of something she filed away very carefully and did not look at yet, because there was still tomorrow, and tomorrow had to be gotten through first. "Ask me again," she said, "when it's over." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "I will." The morning of the 30th of June came in clear and very still, the kind of morning the North produces in midsummer, as though to demonstrate that it can, the fells sharp-edged and green, and the sky a precise and cloudless blue. Margaret had slept 4 hours and had woken feeling, as she always did before difficult things, completely calm. The calm was not the absence of fear. It was what the fear became when it had run through the machinery and come out the other side as purpose. The household assembled in the estate room, which was large enough and formal enough to serve the purpose, at 9 o'clock. The magistrate, Miss Holt, arrived from the neighboring estate at 8:45, a spare dry man with no apparent interest in theater and a great deal of apparent interest in precision. The bank manager, Mr. Frame, arrived at 5 past, with an assistant who carried a case of documents. Lord Frederick Marne was already there when Margaret came in, standing by the window with the look of a man who has not slept and is not sure what room he is about to be in. Cutbirth was there. He was seated at the table with his documents arranged before him, and his face arranged in the expression of a man who is professionally untroubled, and Margaret clocked it as the face of someone who had decided which way the room was going to go and had committed to it, and noted that he was wrong. Clara sat in a chair near the door, with her hands folded in her lap and a look of careful, quiet courage that Margaret found she liked very much. Lady Sophia came in last. She was perfectly dressed. The ring was on her right hand. She looked at Margaret, and Margaret looked at her, and Lady Sophia sat down. The Duke was standing at the head of the table. He had said nothing to Margaret since the previous evening, but when she came in and he looked at her, there was something in the gray eyes that was no longer armored, that was simply present, directly and without deflection. She took her place to his right, and he turned to the room. "I have called this meeting," he said, "because there are matters concerning this estate that require resolution before the settlement papers are signed. I will ask Mr. Rennick to begin." Rennick rose from his chair with the deliberate care of an old man who knows where every bone is and respects each one. He set his leather case on the table, and he opened it, and he laid out the ledgers, 5 years of them, in their original bindings, one by one. He spoke plainly and without drama, as a man who has been keeping records for 50 years, speaks, dates, figures, transfers, names. The room was very quiet. Cuthbert's pen moved twice across his pad, and then stopped. Lord Frederick had turned away from the window and was looking at the table as though he had not seen it before. Lady Sophia was perfectly still. When Rennick finished, Margaret said, "Mr. Cuthbert, the loan that was represented to His Grace as the necessity for the settlement papers, can you provide the name of the lending institution and the date of origination?" Cuthbert looked at her. Something moved in his face, a small, precise movement, the adjustment of a man recalibrating who is in charge of the room. "The details are, can you provide the name?" she said. He looked at the papers in front of him. "The loan," he said, "was arranged through a private instrument. There is no loan." She kept her voice entirely, without triumph. "The estate accounts show a surplus." Mr. Rennick's original ledgers, which differ materially from the copies provided to His Grace, show a pattern of transfer to Harman and Vole Bank over 4 years amounting to £18,200, categorized as estate maintenance expenses, in series with payments categorized as property services that appear in different columns under different names. She produced the ledgers and the papers Rennick had prepared. "Mr. Frame, as manager of the Ashvale Bank, can you confirm the current estate balance?" Frame opened his case. "The estate account as of this week stands at £9,400. There are no outstanding loans held against the estate." She let this sit in the room for one full breath. Then she said, "Mr. Cuthbert, the settlement agreement was represented to Miss Fenn's family solicitor as necessary to address estate debts that do not exist, who gave you instructions to represent it in those terms." Cuthbert said nothing. She turned to Lady Sophia. "The estate ledgers I have just produced predate the period of your management of the household accounts, Lady Sophia. The transfers to Harman and Vole begin exactly 2 months after you took over the accounts. Can you explain the connection between your management and those transfers?" Lady Sophia looked at her with the old steady composure, and then she said, "I am not required to explain anything to you." "No," Margaret agreed, "but you may be required to explain it to Mr. Holt, who is a magistrate of this county and is present in this room." She did not look at Holt, she looked at Lady Sophia, or to the bank in London, to which 2 letters were carried by courier in the past week, in which certain transfers were discussed. She paused. "I know the address, Lady Sophia, and I know the contents, because Clara, when she came to me, described the letters she carried in enough detail that the address and the sum and the name of the correspondent can be established if someone writes to the bank today and asks to stop the transfer before it clears." Lady Sophia was very still now. The dark red ring caught the morning light. Clara, Margaret said, without turning around, when you carried the letter to the address in Threadneedle Street, was there a name on the outer envelope? Clara's voice from the door was very clear. Yes, Miss Fenn. It was addressed to a Mr. P. Harmon, and the other letter, the one that went to a private address in Marylebone, was addressed in Lady Sophia's own hand. Do you remember the name on that one? Yes, it was the same name as on the bank account in the ledger, the one that Mr. Rennick. That is enough. Lady Sophia's voice was still beautiful, but it was different in quality from every other time Margaret had heard it. It had an edge in it now that was not cruelty, but something more like exhaustion, and underneath the exhaustion, something that was almost. In the gray morning light of the estate room, with the witnesses at the table, grief, it is enough. The room was perfectly silent. Outside the window, a bird, a single thrush, was doing what thrushes do in the morning, regardless of what the humans were about. The Duke said, very quietly, Sophia, she looked at him. And Margaret saw, in that look, what she had glimpsed in the doorway the afternoon before, the shape of a very long rivalry, or a very long desire for something that had never been given, resolved now into something that no longer had a useful name. Her cousin. The house she had managed for 2 years as though it were her own, the ring on her hand that she had been wearing because it was close to the thing she had wanted and had not been able to otherwise hold. These were not excuses, but they were reasons, and Margaret filed them away in the part of herself that understood the difference. The ring, the Duke said. Lady Sophia took it off. She set it on the table in front of him with a small, clear sound, and she did not look away from him when she did it. There was something in her face that Margaret did not expect and had no word for, and she looked away from it. The Duke looked at the ring on the table for a moment. Then he looked up at the room. Mr. Holt, he said, I will rely on you to advise me on the legal requirements. Whatever they are, I intend to meet them. He looked at Cuthbert. I will require, by the end of today, a full accounting of the sums managed through your office in connection with this estate and the Harmon and Vole transfers. He said this with the flat precision of a man who does not need to raise his voice because the weight of what he is saying does that work for him. If that accounting is complete and accurate, I am willing to close the matter without further proceedings. If it is not, Cuthbert said, it will be complete. He looked at Lord Frederick, who had said nothing for the duration of the meeting, and was looking at his wife with an expression Margaret would not have known how to read 2 weeks ago, and could read now, not anger, not blame, but the exhausted look of a man who had known something was wrong for longer than this morning, and had been unable, or unwilling, or afraid to name it. Frederick, Clara will need to return to Bath. See that she is comfortably settled. He paused, and I think you might consider what arrangement would suit both of you better than the current one. Lord Frederick nodded once. Carefully, the Duke looked at Lady Sophia. There is an estate in Cumberland that belonged to my mother's sister and has stood empty for 3 years. The income from it is modest and the house is cold, and it will require work before it is comfortable. I will make it available to you. He said this as he had said everything in that room, without flourish, without anger, without any appearance of victory. The ring was not yours to keep. The rest was not yours to take. But the estate will be yours to make use of. And that is the end of it. Lady Sophia looked at him for a long moment. Then she said very quietly, you were always your mother's son. She stood and walked to the door and did not look at anyone else in the room and went through it. The silence that followed was complete, and into it the thrush outside the window sang 3 clear notes, as though it had been waiting. Margaret looked at the ring on the table. The Duke picked it up and held it for a moment in his palm, not a gesture of possession, more like the acknowledgement of an account settled. Then, he looked at her. The witnesses were gathering their papers. Rennick was putting the ledgers back in his case with the careful satisfaction of a man who has at last put a long-carried thing down. Frame and his assistant were making their farewells to the magistrate. Clara, near the door, was looking at Margaret with the bright, slightly tearful look of someone who has been in the presence of something that mattered and knows it. The room began to empty, the way rooms do after proceedings that have concluded, and Margaret stayed where she was until it was only herself and the Duke at the table. He set the ring down between them. "It should go back to the estate," she said, "into whatever keeping your mother intended." Yes, he did not move it yet. He looked at her, and the gray eyes were open in a way they had not been when she arrived in the kitchen garden on the morning of the solstice, or at dinner that first night, or at any point in the past 2 weeks that she could precisely name. "Miss Fenn. Your Grace." Margaret. She had not expected her name in that register, in his voice, quiet and direct and entirely without performance, and she found that she had nothing immediately to say, which was not an experience she often had. "I told you," he said, "that there are things I could not yet lay before you. I believe I have now laid them before you." He paused. "There is one more." She waited. "I am not a man who speaks easily about—" He stopped. She watched him navigate the sentence with the care of someone crossing unfamiliar ground that might or might not hold. "About what I feel. I have been managing things alone for long enough that the habit is difficult to break. I am aware that my methods of managing, this past year, have not served the people around me or the estate." "No," she said, "though the drainage work on the east field is quite good." He looked at her. And this time, the thing that happened to his face arrived completely. Not the small movement she had seen in the kitchen garden, not the near laugh in the evening dark, but an actual, unreserved, unguarded smile, brief and warm and entirely unlike the mask of gravity he wore. And she felt it somewhere she was not ready for, and catalogued this fact and put it aside. "The drainage work," he said, "is excellent. I am also trying to tell you that I would like you to stay." She looked at the table, at the ring, at her hands, which she had schooled to stillness. "As what?" she said. "As—" He stopped again. "Not as a solution, not as the other half of an arrangement, not as anything your staying would owe me or would buy you." He said this with a deliberateness that she recognized as the deliberateness of a man who has thought about the exact shape of the thing he wants to say and is now saying it. "I want you to stay because you are the most useful and honest and a pause. And the finest person I have met in a very long time, and this kitchen garden is going to rust to ruin without you, and I find that I cannot." He stopped a third time and looked at the window where the thrush had been, and then looked back at her. "Marry me because you wish it," he said. "It is the only reason I will take." She thought about a woman in Devizes who had sold her better dress for a coach fare. She thought about the solicitor's letter folded in her cuff. She thought about composure as the register of feeling, which she had practiced for so long that she was not entirely sure what was under it, except that it was there, and was currently making itself known in the steadiness required to keep her hands flat on the table. "I wish it," she said. "Provided you will continue to consult me on the ledgers, I would be a fool not to." "Yes," she said. "You would." They were married 6 weeks later, on a morning in early September, when the fells were beginning to go gold at the edges, in the church at the edge of the Ashvale estate, with the door left open to the morning air. Rennick was there in the front pew, in his best coat, upright as ever, and when the register was signed, he produced a handkerchief from his pocket and applied it to his face with dignity and then replaced it. Clara was there, having returned to Ashvale for the occasion from Bath, where she was getting on considerably better now that she was not carrying anyone else's letters. The thrush, or one very like it, was in the churchyard oak and had opinions. The wedding breakfast was simple and very good, and Mrs. Hartley, who had developed over 6 weeks from cautious to warm to fiercely loyal, oversaw it with the composure of a general commanding a well-run campaign. Lord Frederick, it had been decided, by both Lord Frederick and the Duke, in a conversation that Margaret had not attended but whose outcome had been reported to her in its essentials, would take a house near his wife in Cumberland for the winter, and would spend the following spring deciding what he wished his life to look like. He seemed, in the weeks between the estate room and the wedding, to have lost something he had been carrying for a long time and was cautiously exploring what it felt like to have his hands free. He had, at the wedding breakfast, said something that made Clara laugh out loud and looked pleased about it. Cutbirth's accounting had been complete and accurate. The money was recoverable in portions over the subsequent year. He retired from practice, quietly, and was not heard from again in any professional capacity. The house in Cumberland was made habitable, and Lady Sophia took up residence in it before the first frost. She did not write. But in the spring, through an intermediary, a solicitor in Carlisle, she made a gift to the parish church at Ashvale of 3 stained glass panels, which arrived without explanation or dedication. The middle panel was a woman at a window with light coming through. Margaret looked at it for a long time when it was installed, and thought about the shape of a very long rivalry resolved into something quieter, and said nothing. The estate accounts, by December, were in better order than they had been in 6 years. Margaret had the upper pastures replanted in the 2nd week of October, before the ground hardened, and there were calculations done at the kitchen table on 3 successive evenings that Crispin participated in, initially by watching, and then by contributing, and eventually by arguing. And they argued well, cleanly and productively, and with the quality of 2 people who have decided that accuracy is more important than agreement. He had a habit, when he was working, of pressing his thumb against the knuckle of his first finger, and she had named this to herself as the gesture that meant he was about to see something he had missed, and she had never told him she had named it. She told him on a morning in April, almost a year after the solstice, when she came into the library to find him standing at the east shelf with a book open in his hand, reading, and she said, "You are doing the thing with your thumb again. What have you found?" He looked up. And the gravity was still there, and the gray eyes were still austere, and the grief that had lived in his face had not vanished, but had settled differently, had become, she thought, part of the architecture of him rather than the whole of it, which was what grief does when it is properly housed and not required to furnish the entire room. And he showed her what he had found, which was a record in the household books of an account her father had opened, years before the debt, which had been incorrectly closed, and which had, at that moment, a small amount of money in it. Not much, but existing, which was more than she had believed for 15 years. "It does not settle anything," he said. "No," she said. "But it is there. That is sufficient." He closed the book, and he looked at her in the morning light of the library, the spring light that came through the east windows and made the room warm, and he said, "The kitchen garden is going to want that copper sulfate spray again. The rust never entirely went." "I know," she said. "I ordered it last week." He did the thing with his thumb. "Of course you did. Come and look at the beans," she said. And they went out through the library door and across the courtyard and into the kitchen garden, where the early green was coming up in rows, and the thrush was doing its morning business in the apple tree, and the light was long and clean over the fells, and it was the beginning of the day, and the year was new, and everything that was broken was not mended, but was named, which is the first step, and the morning pressed warmly down on both of them, like a hand that meant no harm. If this story settled something in you, the small, fierce pleasure of a truth made plain before the right people, the particular relief of being finally, exactly seen, then you have sat at this fireside before, and you know the warmth it keeps. There is always a chair here, a candle on the ledge, a kettle at the simmer for whoever arrives in from the cold. We would love for you to stay. If Ashevale has found its way into your keeping, tell us in the comments which moment decided it for you. The kitchen garden, the ring on the table, the thrush going on regardless. Your answers are the best part of the fire. If you subscribe to Hearthside Tales, you keep a place here for every story after this one. Sleep well, and may you always know the shape of the gap, and find someone worth crossing the country to stand beside in the light.